Hello and welcome to our virtual masterclass. How will we live and work post-pandemic? That billion-dollar question. My name's Zoe Kleinman. I'm a technology journalist and a presenter at the BBC, and I'm very happy to be your host today for the next hour or so. Broadband permitting, of course. Speaking of which, with the pandemic accelerating existing trends in remote work, e-commerce and automation, today's talk will welcome three incredible experts who are going to share with us their insights into what the future of how we live and work might look like in a post-pandemic world. If you've got any questions during our speaker sessions this afternoon, please do pop them into the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your screen right down there. We're going to get through as many of those as possible at the end when we have a big panel discussion and get everyone together. So you don't have to wait till then. If you've got any questions, stick them in as soon as they enter your minds. Right, that's enough from me, I think. Let's crack on with our first speaker. As the political editor of the Sunday Times, Tim Shipman's been a national newspaper journalist for nearly 20 years. He's a trusted confidant of politicians from all parties. You may have spotted him last week on Have I Got News for You? So we're really looking forward to hearing his insights on what the political and economic landscape might look like later in 2021. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks very much indeed, and very good of you all to tune in here on such a lovely day. As just said, you know, my bag is politics, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on on the political scene and how that might well both influence and force politicians to reflect on some of those big seismic changes that we can expect to see in our world. You know, on the one hand, this looks quite familiar. There's a lot of stuff going on at the moment, filling the newspapers, filling up the TV schedules, which looks from a world that is familiar. You know, a prime minister up to his eyes in the lobbying scandal, football administrators making prats of themselves, and the Scottish National Party, you know, apparently on the verge of romping to victory. This might be 2014, but of course, as we know, we are in the midst of, you know, pretty seismic events with both Brexit to start with as the sort of background context, and then of course you know, COVID, which has dominated everything for the last year. And those two things together, I think, have not only changed the way a lot of business is done in government, but will also change the way we live going forwards. The pandemic has revealed a lot about what works and what doesn't in Whitehall and in government departments and in local government, and it's also caused them to look at the world differently, try to do things differently, because there's been a lot of really big stuff that they've needed to do fast, and it's also created a whole load of problems which politicians and all the rest of us are going to have to deal with going forward. So have a look at those problems to start with. You know, quite apart from, you know, a massive health crisis, which we now appear, touch wood, to be getting on top of, you have got a huge backlog of problems across the whole of government. The health service is the obvious case, focusing on COVID deaths and saving lives there has meant that, you know, there are millions and millions of people who have not had the cancer treatment that they're supposed to have, who have not had the elective operations that they were hoping to have. And so you've got a huge problem there that needs dealing with. The other area that ministers are really concerned about, and Boris Johnson, we are told, is making this his top priority, is a sort of a group of kids who are falling dramatically behind as a result of schools being away for the better part of a year. Through the various lockdowns, you know, a lot of schools lost, you know, probably 3/4 of their actual teaching time over the last year, even if in, you know, most days they were trying to do something via Zoom. As we are today, it's not quite the same as having those kids in the classroom. And what they're finding, of course, is that the people who have the most difficult backgrounds, the most disadvantages, are the people hit hardest by that. So you have a whole raft of problems there that people want to deal with. And a lot of people I speak to in government think that this is a sort of problem that will go on, you know, for decades. You will look back in 20, 30 years time and see that people who have fallen behind now will have their life chances considerably hit unless ministers do something about it in the next few months. The other thing that's interesting in a general sense is the issue of trust in politics, and you've seen that hit in a lot of ways in recent years, and the lack of trust appears to be driving a lot of what goes on in politics. There's a very nifty pollster called James Canagasorium who helped the Tories get loads of seats in Scotland a few years ago, and he's quite a sharp guy. He's gone back and looked at the evidence of recent British elections, the Brexit referendum, Jeremy Corbyn doing so well in 2017, Donald Trump's wins in the States, and Boris Johnson's general election victory here, and showing that voters on left and right who mistrust institutions have been the ones turning out to vote in those elections. They're also very hard to find in opinion polls. So politicians who can find them, as Boris Johnson appears to have been able to do, and briefly Jeremy Corbyn did, have a bit of an advantage. So that's going to change the way politics operates, and the way the choices those people make will shape the world we're all going to be living in. There are lots of backlogs across Whitehall. You hear that passports is a major issue. Loads of stuff like that has just simply not happened. So government has a huge task on its hand. And as a result of that, what you're going to see in the next few months is a concerted effort to deal with those sort of problems I've been outlining. You're going to have a Queen's speech the second week of May. You'll probably see a cabinet reshuffle, and you're going to then see a whole series of sort of bigger things coming out. There'll be a budget later in the year. We've got the COP summit, where you'll see a massive shift towards green issues and green energy and green jobs to try and rebuild what's going on in the employment sector, which obviously is a looming horror that ministers are very concerned about. Now, the edge has been taken off that. People were predicting 4 million unemployed at one stage. We're at about half that at the moment. But clearly, when the government lifts more of the pandemic support later into the autumn, you've potentially got a huge economic crisis on your hands. You'll see packages of, extra tutoring for kids. You'll see potentially the school day lengthening. And the interesting thing here is that, you've got a government that has shown that it's willing to spend huge amounts of money on tackling problems, and the public no longer seems to mind that. In fact, is pretty, most of the polls suggest that people want to see a step change in how we now operate politically. The debates that were common 10 or 12 years ago are now completely defunct, and this is why Labour is finding it slightly difficult to get a throttle hold on Boris Johnson, because here's a Tory who talks about levelling up and who wants to spend huge amounts of money on infrastructure and on helping out those people who've been hit by this pandemic. So conventional politics is going to look a little bit different. But the most interesting work in government is what's going on about what this might all really mean for the future. Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, and some of the more intelligent ministers, Michael Gove amongst them, are already looking at, yes, we can put loads of money into tutoring kids, but might we be better off thinking, more structurally? Do we need a school day that finishes at 3:30? Could we not extend that? There's obviously problems with the teaching unions in getting them to agree to work longer hours. What about the summer holidays, which are this gargantuan long period, which was based in the old days around people needing to go off and bring in the harvest? That seems to be antiquated now. A lot of people would like to see 4 major terms a year rather than 3, with sort of 2-3 week holidays between them rather than 6. There's a lot of evidence that kids fall behind in that 6-week break. Would that be a better way of doing things? Could we be applying for university based on the results that we've already got, rather than this sort of system that we've had for years, where you get your estimated grades, then you get your place at university, and then you go off after that? So there's a lot of people thinking about those big structural things. The good news is that a lot of what government has had to do over the last year has shown that there is potential, if you do things right, to do things well, do things at scale, and do things quickly. The vaccine rollout is the obvious example of that. It's a very good blend of some public money going into a private enterprise, and the government backing a whole range of potential vaccines, 7 or 8 of them at once, and a lot of them have come up trumps. People were talking about needing to be take a decade to do these things, certainly 2 to 3 years, and they turned it around in a matter of months. And there's a wartime atmosphere in Whitehall, and you know, in the Second World War, you saw huge leaps forward in technology and the health service and all the rest of it, and you're going to get the same to a degree here. Look at what hasn't happened. One of the things I thought was most obviously going to happen last year was when, you know, a huge influx of new unemployed went into the benefits system. You know, knowing that IT in government is useless generally, you all assumed that their Department for Work and Pensions computer system would fall over. Well, it didn't. Someone at the top of government said to me, actually, Ian Duncan Smith, bizarrely, is one of the heroes of COVID because he insisted on the digitalisation of the DWP a few years ago in order to bring in this new universal credit benefit. Now, UC has not been a roaring triumph in some places, you know, in terms of the decisions that have been made about who gets it and who doesn't. But on the evidence of what's happened in the last year, the system held up and actually has coped with this. Now, if you can start to see that happening in other departments, you can start to have things working quickly. They've shown that Zoom government works. You don't all have to be in a room together. That creates huge opportunities for moving different parts of government around the country, and that's what Boris Johnson wants to do. The Treasury are, you know, creating various outposts in the north, as are various other government departments. Department of Transport is heading off to the Midlands, large parts of it, and so you'll be able to see things function, you know, on a different basis. The other thing that people might look at differently is, you know, we've probably got a slightly different view of risk now. Ministers always used to do everything up to the last minute. A lot of business and industry did. The health service certainly did. It's possible now that you'll see more capacity built in, more of that sort of comfort zone that you might need in a crisis. So we might approach things differently there. The other stuff, that big picture stuff that I know ministers are looking at is, you know, what does it mean if large numbers of people are working from home? How do we revitalise our high streets if, you know, a lot of that office space is no longer required? There are some benefits there. You could create a lot of affordable housing in the centre of towns, and people who've been driven to the margins will suddenly find that it's affordable to live back in the middle again. That could have huge social implications. What about employers and the tax regime? You know, a lot of employers at the moment are resisting paying people who work from home any money for their heating or their electricity. I would have thought if you want to woo the best people to go and work for you, that sort of thing will change, and it could be a process that government encourages with tax breaks for that sort of thing. What does this all mean for the housing market? These are big issues that you know, government has not remotely yet fully got to grips with, but it's encouraging to me, at least, that they are beginning to think about them. And I'm sure some of our future speakers will have more intelligent things to say about them than ministers yet do. The big picture of politics, though, is that there's been a huge sort of seismic shift in who is voting for who and why. Brexit, to a degree, has led to a sort of recalibration. The kind of people who were voting for the Conservative Party 20 years ago, in large number, are not now, partly as a result of Brexit. The map has been redrawn, and the challenge for politicians is to adapt to it quickly and find ways of appealing to people. So COVID has presented huge problems. To a degree, it's highlighted what some of those solutions might be in terms of digitization and more flexible working. And the politicians that can respond most quickly and effectively to these new problems will be the ones that are successful going forward. But what's happened has shaped all our lives. It will shape the government that runs us. And if we don't like what they're doing, we will be electing another one.
Thank you very much for that, Tim Shipman. Isn't it weird to think that part of the good news is that government servers didn't fall over during the crisis? If you were playing Call of Duty last night and you got caught up in their server problems, how odd to think if only Ian Duncan Smith had been involved, we might have been all right. Let's move on to our second speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Scott Bales, the MD of Innovation Labs Asia. Scott Bales partners with organisations around the world as they embark on their own innovation journey. When it comes to technological innovation, Scott is the leading authority on the subjects. No pressure here, Scott. We can't wait to hear what you have to share with regards to the future. Welcome, Scott.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks, Tim, for the insights. It's great to hear, you know, how the other side of the world is going. I'm based in Singapore. I'm an Australian, so we have a a slightly different journey, which is quite interesting to learn from. But I had a very unfortunate opportunity actually 13 years ago, which gave me a lot of lessons that's very applicable for this period of time. And that is, after 10 years working for an Australian bank, I got bored. I wanted to go on an adventure, and the bank decided to dump me in Cambodia, a country that was just coming out of civil war, had almost no infrastructure, was facing a huge amount of change in a short period of time. And a lot of the incumbent knowledge and assets and infrastructure that I'd taken for granted so much in Australia just wasn't there. So we had to rethink things, rethink approaches, find new frameworks, new ways to build business models, new ways to build even business continuity. And the lessons of that that year have never been more applicable than now in this post-COVID world, when essentially everything that we've taken for granted to where we've got to today has almost been erased. I mean, and there's a number of quotes in industry today that we've accelerated digital transformation at twice the rate in the last 12 months. Remember, that means we've had more digital transformation in the last 12 months than we had in the previous decade. So that means, for instance, whether it's digitization of business, supply chains, daily life, has totally changed. And what I want to do is I want to quickly share a curve that it's not even mine. It comes from Geoffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm. Bear with me. And it's basically the innovation adoption curve. What it allows us to understand is that in the adoption of anything in society, whether it's change of a new technology, whether it's the adoption of a new behavior in society, a new business model, it actually goes through a series of phases. And that is, we have our early adopters first, they pounce on everything. They're the people who have the latest gadgets, they do the new things first. But the vast majority of the world requires the early adopter to be an example for them, so they can actually follow and actually believe that that change is possible. And so the vast majority of the world has now actually been seen and forced that the digitization of almost anything is possible. As Tim referred to before, we had governments before that would adamant that we have to have government by face-to-face. Yeah, we've been forced to do it in a remote life. We've seen more policies passed in the last 12 months. We've had emergency measures put in place without face-to-face meetings. We've had some of the largest M&A deals in history have been done in the last 12 months. And all these things that they would have insisted that has to be done face-to-face. But the interesting part for me actually is not so much what we've done through COVID, but it's how we recover from COVID. And we've all been now comfortable living in our lounge rooms or bedrooms, working from home. I think there's 1,000 memes out there of parents with kids tied up underneath the desk as they attempt to do a Zoom call. But there's also a new lifestyle that we're also adapting to, is that there was a Forbes study just a week ago that said 83% of people now have no desire to return to 9 to 5 in the office. And so that has implications at an infrastructure level, public transportation, public policy, property, as Tim referred to, or even the incentives we have to actually living at home. But the one that I'm actually watching with keen interest is actually how supply chains recover. So one of the things that a lot of the disruptors of the last decade realized, particularly those that have two-sided businesses, so I'm talking about Airbnb, Uber, where they have a supply and a demand side to their business, is actually to how do we rebuild both sides so that neither creates an adverse experience for the other. And that's the simplest one of actually what I was working on last year in Miami is around just an F&B. Is that if any actor in a supply chain is to grow faster or slower than its surrounding actors, its stresses can amplify during a recovery period. That could be as simple as accounts payable slipping by 7 days, or even just the available working capital during a peak season being constrained. These ripple through a supply chain and either accelerate or amplify the stresses of the recovery overall. And this is particularly evident in the trends we've seen in consumption in the last 12 months. We've seen a number of industries that are particularly those dependent on specialized manufacturing in China experience basically supply shortages, while logistics supply chains have been accelerating the actual supply. I'm a passionate cyclist, by the way, and to buy a bicycle right now anywhere in the world is almost impossible. because the global supply has been dried up. And that's changing the economics of a bicycle. Like I know thousands of marketplaces around the world today where people have unique access to either bike parts or bicycles, and scalpers are now selling those at a premium through secondhand markets like eBay, or in our part of the world, carousel. So it's opening up new opportunities. But also consumption itself has changed, because particularly for countries where we had a bias for dining out, and so Singapore is a country that has a very strong dining out culture, a lot of us got forced to change that last year. I mean, for the rest of the world is to understand that, over 80% of Singaporeans eat out every single day. This is not so much around a choice, as opposed to actually the way we live in Singapore in apartments means that for a meal, we can easily go out to a hawker center nearby and have a meal for $2 to $3 to actually sustain life and so forth. And that basically that small part of life has been taken away. And so our consumption models have changed. And as we saw, whether it be packaged goods, F&B, basic supplies have now been forced to go back into the home. And actually what's come out of it is a huge growth. And you don't have to go too far on Instagram to see that cooking is having a recovery in the last 12 months. People actually passionately finding something they want to craft, learning how to do it, and doing it at home. The biggest ones particularly were sourdough bread last year, and that's also growing on the supply chain now. So actually the companies in the supply chain of sourdough bread have seen a massive spike actually in their product demand. I myself have taken on learning to grill with steak. So I've taken on basically sourcing the best quality red meat I can find and learning the various cooking techniques, which has been my passion. And as a result, that's been obviously had a downstream impact. But consumption overall also means that this device, which is already you can't see my virtual background, but the device that has already been our consumption preference with the various apps and ecosystems now mean we are literally buying things more and more from home because we can't go to buy them. This has meant that, for instance, we're seeing things like centralized kitchens, more dependency on logistics ecosystems, warehousing and so forth, that have to optimize their business models in a very, very different way. But the killer, I think, in all of this was actually most evident in sort of the post-pandemic Google search trends we've seen. So for those who don't know, the kind of November through to March Google trends were the key ones were really around online shopping, online doctor, and food delivery, were the three highest trends of any topic. And this is seeing an on-flow effect in terms of how we then engage those various services. So we're seeing huge growth in digital health, particularly either the teledoctors, remote consultation in various markets around the world. And more importantly, building technology that was previously only viable in emerging markets to overcome infrastructure and distribution cost challenges, is now being pushed mainstream in a lot of digital economies. The next is, for most of us, our careers have completely changed. Working from home was either a hugely positive experience for some or a hugely challenging for a ton of others. In particular, like I know just in the pre-briefing, we're talking about setups here is post-COVID, like anyone, I had a computer and an internet connection. So pre-COVID. Post-COVID, I literally have 2 computers, 3 cameras, dual internet, so that this is my place of work. So I have to make sure that it's continuous, it's stable. If I have an emergency, I can switch over very quickly. And this is going to be a setup that has impact at a consumer device level, service provision around ISPs. But more particularly is around how do companies now cater for talent that want to work in a very different way? If 80% of their workforce doesn't want to return to the office, how do they retain, grow, or even attract the talent to sustain their businesses going forward? And for those that actually do go back to work, how does the office look different? How does the logistics of the office look different? We have different setups. We definitely have the limitations around access to the office in some countries. But how do we actually, at scale, actually ensure that our new ways of office, the way we design our offices, are set up for a post-COVID way of working that is both multimodal, multi-location, and caters for a different way of working. But what's really been evident in under all of this, and for those that are really into the stock markets, is actually watching the stocks that have performed quite well in the last 12 months. Which is quite timely, because just before this call, I was watching the US airlines results announcements. And so American Airlines and Southwest were just announcing their growth coming out of mid-March. And so they're actually seeing putting 50% capacity back on, which is a good sign. But more importantly, we've seen companies last year like Netflix, like Zoom, go through absolute skyrocketing share prices, just based on simple things around market potential, around new levels of demand, flexibility of their distribution model and commercial models. Just seeing a huge shift in how investors see stocks, which even at a retail level, but means that institutional money can be changed in a very different direction to enable a whole bunch of new businesses. And we've seen, in particular, even though we've been in a remote location, we've seen more IPOs in the last 12 months than any year prior to that. And it just absolutely staggers me. And most of those are digital centric or digital native businesses. So what we're summing up is around, as we come back to the work post pandemic, is asking ourselves how we're going to survive, or even more importantly, how we're going to thrive. And so the approach that I've typically, advising my clients to do is to first start with the whys. Like, what has changed in terms of your purpose, the context of how you actually, where your business operates, where your employees operate, and understand what is the new purpose. Because for many customers and for your workforce, that purpose has changed. The next is accepting that there is a new normal. The new normal is the 9 to 5 has been essentially erased, and we have an opportunity to start with a blank slate. How do we engineer a new way of work that not only empowers our workforce, but aligns to either the values, the ethics, or even the future of our business? The next is around realizing that in a world where we have distributed ecosystems, the number one priority in 2021 will be security. Endpoint security company stocks all went up over 500% last year, purely because of the very urgent need to facilitate and secure a distributed workforce, which means we have new risks. Like, if I am here working for a regulated company or a highly data sensitive company from my home, what are the new risks that we have to consider in operations? The last thing is really that we're going through a new period, is make sure we make the effort to actually learn things before we try and set rules around them. As we move at a fast pace, we tend to try and basically impose boundaries and limitations on things, particularly on things that we don't understand. We've seen this particularly as a number of businesses had to digitize, and they've imposed either procurement or security or policy rules around technologies they just don't understand yet. But the main thing is realizing that we are living in a very dynamic world. Things could change again next week, the month after, as the recovery comes back up. So taking small incremental steps is around understanding where our market will go. Because our first principle of in a post-pandemic world is everything we had before has to be erased. We have to accept that we know nothing again. And only by separating ourselves from that pre-pandemic mindset and incumbency, we'll free ourselves up for the potentials of a post-pandemic world. We're actually, from a business standpoint and a workforce standpoint, presented with an opportunity that almost no generation in history has been given. And that is an acceleration of our productivity levels, an acceleration of our economic potential, and acceleration of our choice in the way we work. But navigating those three choices is going to be a challenge across a number of industries. But the one thing I want to, basically my hero story of the pandemic is I got to put out there, I'm a bit of a fanboy of Tony Robbins. But if anyone has ever been to a Tony Robbins, Unleash the Power Within event, it's entrancing. He does this thing with you for 3 days that changes your life. But Tony has built a platform in a pandemic that is absolutely staggering. He is one of the few people in this industry, particularly the speaker industry, that has managed to grow his audience by almost double during the pandemic. And I encourage you, if you have the time, to go and actually have a look at his virtual stadium framework he's been setting up, where he's engaging up to 40,000 people an event from his home. Well, it's actually not his home, it's a warehouse not far from his home, but around how do we reach audiences and build businesses in a very different way. This is an individual that was paid a lot of money to get on stage, to be physically present, a business that all of us are a part of, but he's managed to reinvent himself. And I'm looking to that as an example of what's really possible in this post-pandemic world.
Thank you so much for that very enlightening talk. I'd like to share with you briefly my own lockdown journey. When I left my newsroom in March 2020, I decided to challenge myself by learning how to cook, how to craft, and how to do weightlifting. A year later, I'm challenging myself to sit on my sofa and eat cake that I bought in the supermarket. So I'm quite proud of it. I think it's going really well. Time now to introduce you to our final speaker before we all get together for the Q&A at the end. Thank you so much for your questions, by the way. Please do keep putting them in the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of the screen there. It is delightful for me now to welcome Cally Beaton, former Senior Vice President at Viacom. Cally's an expert speaker on change, inspirational leadership, creative culture, and what millennials expect in the workplace. Please join me in welcoming Cally Beaton.
Thank you so much. And I'm very much with you, Zoe, in terms of what my own personal change has involved during the pandemic. So this is lovely, isn't it? In my career, I've had the pleasure of dancing till dawn with Beyonce. I've had dinner with Idris Elba. I've been on a private plane with Elton John, but never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be spending my Thursday afternoon at a speaker's corner virtual masterclass. So I guess my first message would be dream big, everybody. This could be how life is for you. And it was great when Speaker's Corner said, do you want to come and talk about what the future holds, Cally? I thought that is absolutely fantastic because I have no idea. But what I do know is I know a fair bit about change and reinvention. So I'm going to share with you a couple of my thoughts. And I'm also going to tell you about a conversation that changed my life. I should also point out that I have got a right shiner of a black eye, not because I've changed careers and just gone 3 rounds with Conor McGregor, but because I've taken up running and I fell over. So if you like what I say today, then I'll make sure I bash myself on the head again when you book me to say it to you again. And if not, I'll change it completely and it's concussion. So with those caveats firmly in place, I'm going to start by talking about human connection, because it's my belief that commercial excellence comes hugely from human connection. And that as we go through our working lives, IQ, which we'll all assume everybody here has in spades, that's very important, but EQ becomes absolutely as important, if not more important than IQ. So what's happened in the world at the moment is everything's got smaller, hasn't it? And all those serendipitous, brilliant things that used to happen where we'd have a random conversation with somebody that we weren't expecting to have, that's all gone. And the world has got very personal to our bedrooms or our front rooms. I'm going to show an image to you. So when you look at this, you will be able to see an image. Lots of you will be able to see 2 pictures. Those of you who can only see 1 picture, this is not an IQ test, absolutely nothing wrong with you, but I will just explain where the 2 pictures are. There's a rabbit with ears, an eye and a little twitchy nose. And then if you turn the ears into a beak, you've got some kind of animal, a duck maybe, with a little beak, an eye and a twitchy little strange hole in the back of its head. Now, why am I showing this to you? You're busy people with things to do. Well, you'll all remember this image. This went viral a few years ago, and this was the most stark example of what I just showed you, where everybody saw the cream and the gold dress, or the blue and the green dress, and blue and the black dress, and no one could believe that what they were looking at was completely different to the thing that someone else had right in front of them. So I guess my first message about living in a lockdown and post-lockdown world would be to mind the gap between our world and the other people that we're dealing with. And we may have to be quite creative in how we learn to bridge that gap. And I'm going to give you a couple of ideas from my own career. And I will, by the way, just give a quick example, if I may, of how misunderstandings can very easily happen. I ended up sending my ex a text last night just to see if he fancied going for a socially distanced drink. And autocorrect changed it to "You've ruined my life. I hope I never see you again." So all I'm saying is that misunderstandings can happen, right? In or out of a pandemic. But a couple of thoughts on this before I move into a story of professional and then personal change is we used to do a thing when I was at MTV. Zoe mentioned I was on the board of Viacom for the past 10 years. And the things that we worked on, the brands we had were brands like Paramount Pictures, Comedy Central, MTV, Nickelodeon, quite young skewing brands. So when I was at senior level in that company in my 40s, I had no idea what people that age actually felt like watching our shows. I knew how to monetize them. So what we did is we had reverse mentoring. We would try and engage with younger, less experienced voices in the business. We would have more junior members of staff who would sit on our program development boards and influence the editorial decisions we were making. And you know when I knew that was working? When we stopped calling it reverse mentoring. Because why would somebody very different and much less professionally experienced than me not have plenty to teach me about how I might approach my professional life? So my first message is, let's get more comfortable with being uncomfortable, and let's somehow find a way of seeking out difference in our professional networks, because a lot has changed and we may only have heard the viewpoints of the people who we tend to gravitate towards, who are people like us. Now, I also want to talk about two stories of change and reinvention. The first is from my professional life. So working at MTV, as I did, the first time I worked there was not too long after its launch. I'm a woman in my 50s, by the way, and I'll take your silence as stunned. So some of you may be nearly as ancient as me, and you may know that MTV launched in 1981, and it was a world-beating, enormously powerful brand. It was iconic, and it was all about the music video. That's all they did, wall-to-wall music television. The M in MTV was for music. The very first video that was played on MTV was Video Killed the Radio Star back in 1981. And then something came along to kill the music video, or certainly the music video on MTV, Napster, MySpace, later on YouTube. Suddenly the whole of MTV's inventory was available anywhere in the world, anytime, anyhow. And MTV had to reinvent its entire business model before the very eyes of its viewers. And MTV started commissioning content like Beavis and Butthead, The Real World. Nowadays, the M in music television, it does not stand for music anymore. They took the music out of music television. They became part of Viacom. They spread their business risk across channel launches instead of it all being about individual channel programming in the United States. And to this day, MTV is still a very, very successful international business. And then what happened next? Well, Scott touched on this when he was talking just now, digital transformation. Well, I'm sure all of you are an erudite enough audience to have thought about the impact of streaming services on traditional broadcasters. Netflix, that's a 20-year-old story now, although we've only been aware of it over here probably for more like a decade plus, but it's been around for 20 years. And think about a business like Disney Plus. They launched in March last year at the start of lockdown. What a brilliant time to be running a streaming service. Netflix, Tiger King, who wasn't watching that? But the change will keep coming. Netflix is having to reinvent now. They've announced their subscriber base now flattening off and even lessening in the light of the whole world opening up. So the only thing we know is that the future will be different, and it will be radically different. And the very last thing I want to tell you is a personal story of reinvention, because reinvention can mean two things, right? It could be radical reinvention, or it could be something tinier, like the butterfly effect. That's chaos theory, right? That the tiny perturbation of the flapping of the wings of a butterfly will have a direct effect on the date, the course, and the strength of a tornado many weeks hence. So whether you're thinking as you watch this about a radical reinvention of yourself or your business, or a tiny flapping of the wings that might have a radical impact. I was always a little nervous of change. And when I was working at Viacom, I had the pleasure of, on the Comedy Central slate, getting to know some incredible A-list talent. I name dropped a few of them shamelessly at the start of what I was talking to you about today. And I had the pleasure of working several times with the late, great Joan Rivers. And I would introduce her to the stage at events that were held for drunken television executives for us to try and get them to invest in shows with her in. And I would intro her to the stage. Got to know her quite well. And the very last time I saw her, which was over dinner, just a few weeks before she died. Not connected, I should add that. And she said to me, she said, Cally, you should think about taking up stand-up comedy. And I said, Joan, I'm 45. I'm a single parent of 2 kids. One of them's got special needs. I've got a rather big day job. The ship has sailed. It's too late. And she said, Cally, I'm 81. You're in the thick of it. Why don't you? And a month after that, I did my first ever stand-up gig. I now am lucky enough to work as a stand-up comedian and a performer. And in the words of the late, great Bob Monkhouse, everybody laughed when I said I wanted to be a comedian, but they're not laughing now. So very last thing for me is about underestimation. So if we're thinking about what we can do differently, and crucially what our business contacts and people who work for us and people we engage with in whatever capacity in our careers, it's about us opening our minds to the fact that what we see is perhaps not always what we get in terms of the talent that we can work with and the business opportunities that might be unlocked within. And a very last postscript for me before we open up to the panel is that when I turned 50 last year, it coincided with a B-list French celebrity, a man by the name of Yann Moix, making global headlines because he said a woman at 50 is invisible. So you're very lucky to be seeing me today. And I decided, well, is that right, monsieur? And that year I decided I would take to the Edinburgh Festival a show called Invisible. I decided to become more visible than I'd ever been and to see what life might hold, even if I jettisoned, as I then did, my day job and made my side hustle my main hustle. So that's my last comment really, is to say maybe your side hustle might become your main hustle. And if that's been necessitated by the pandemic, that might be a pretty good thing. So I'll leave you, because I'm an inspirational speaker, on an inspirational quote. The greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but that it is too low and we reach it. Michelangelo. Isn't that amazing that that quote came from a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle? So with that, I'm going to hand back to the marvelous Zoe.
Cally, thank you so much for a really inspirational and motivational talk. I want to try and kind of summarize a few that are along the same theme. And I want to ask each of you in turn what you think. There's a few questions along the lines of, how do we keep this momentum going now that we've had to work so differently, now that we've had to embrace this change? Or are we just going to sort of scurry back to our old security of the 9 to 5 in the office because it's what we remember and we kind of miss it a bit now? What way are we going to go? And if we are going to keep innovating, how are we going to sustain it? Perhaps Tim, you'd like to start.
Well, I mean, my personal experience is that about a quarter of people have stayed in our office throughout. It's very difficult to put out a newspaper without a sort of core of staff, but a very large number of my colleagues seem to have no inclination to return to the office at all. And that's an interesting thing, because on the face of it, they can file their copy from whichever bucolic corner of the land they are gazing out of the window at. Personally, I like to be in the office at the business end of the week. I don't mind a bit of a commute. I get a chance to read. And most importantly, I've got more chance of influencing what goes in the newspaper and where it goes if I'm in the office. And I find it slightly curious that a lot of people would sort of abdicate that opportunity. So I think you're going to see, things develop in different ways. Different people have a different approach, and employers are going to have to be more flexible. One thing they're thinking about in government is if a bunch of people basically don't want to lose touch with the office, but certainly don't want to go in every day, season tickets to people commuting into London or other parts of the land are going to need to be different. You can't be expecting people to pay £5,000 up front for an everyday ticket. You're going to need to provide something more flexible. My sense is that a lot of people would like to go in 1, 2, 3 days a week, but maintain the opportunity to see more of their children and work from home for other parts of the week. So employers are going to have to be more flexible. And as I was saying earlier, the government and those employers are going to have to think creatively about how they attract people to go and do those jobs. The final point I'd make, which I think is probably the most important one, is journalism is one of those businesses where the best way to learn is to watch other people do it, to be in a room with them, to ask them questions, but basically to see them in action. And young people are going to find it very difficult to learn if they're just sitting as the sort of 29th person mute on the Zoom call in the corner. And a lot of people, my goddaughter is just coming out of university. I've got a lot of young friends trying to make their way in journalism, who've helped me out with the books I've written, people who've transcribed for me, a lot of them getting on well in life, the ones that have kind of thrust themselves forward and who've been very impressive, have kind of survived all this. But a lot of others that they know tell me that it's very difficult to make your way in the world if you're not able to go into an office and see people. So that is going to have to be thought about by employers if they want a talent pool coming through. And it's the sort of thing that the government ought to be thinking about as well, because it's in everybody's interest. Yes, you can get more productivity out of people not losing 2 hours of their day to a commute, but equally a commute can be good thinking time. And, to have that stream of people coming through, I think people need to think quite creatively about how they do that. Scott, how about you? Are you going to stay in your Minecraft style kingdom that you seem to have fashioned there?
Yeah, I've found, I suppose, a purpose. Like I'm someone who used to live on an airplane over 50% of my time, and I loved it, and I love seeing the world and connecting to people around the world. And I think that as a personal passion will still be there. I think what's going to change is the foundational excuse of you have to go somewhere to do somewhere. That will be taken away, and as Tim said, it's going to be about choices. Like, not everyone's going to want to work from home. Not everyone can, particularly in cities like Singapore, where most of us live in apartments. Working from home is not feasible. But I see things like a resurgence of co-working spaces closer to home. That's going to be one option. There will be the percentage of people that still want to commute to a physical office as well. But I think it really comes down around, at an individual level, of accepting an employer saying that you must do your job from this location, particularly when the perfect example I give is the regulated trading floors of the banks. Like, they've been trading this whole time remotely. So if they can do it, basically anybody can do it. And so it comes down to how do we match preferences, the employer's preference around their workforce model and the individual's preference for how they want to work. And I mean, this has always been the case, isn't it? Around how do we design our companies to attract the right talent, to retain it. It's going to be the same equation, just with some different variables. Personally, myself, I'm going to try and work from home as much as possible. I'm very lucky. There's a mountain bike course out my back gate, which I can get around and back to the computer in an hour. So that's my middle of the day break. And I think it's going to be simple things like that people have learnt to have in their daily habits at home. It's going to be very hard to separate from.
Callie, I bet you can't wait to get back on stage, can you?
No, I can't wait. I have to say, people say is doing what we're doing via Zoom difficult. And I'll tell you what was difficult was one of the ways in which we were delivering comedy was in drive-in gigs. So they would have lots of cars. We would be up on stage like an American old Hollywood drive-in movie. And there's no worse heckle, I will tell you, than when someone just turns their engine on and drives off. That's a very difficult thing to come back from. So I am looking forward to the world reopening. But there definitely are possibilities that I will personally keep that have come out of the pandemic, and that I suspect others may as well. And one of the things that's been really great about this is it's been a real leveler for on-screen talent, because suddenly we can really create content from our own houses. And that's always kind of happened. All of the big US Comedy Central shows, particularly their scripted shows, almost everyone you will see on their schedules, and they invest heavily in scripted content, started online, started as a webisode. Shows like Broad City, which is phenomenally successful over there, that started by two comedians begging forgiveness, not permission, and just getting some content out there. It caught the eye of Amy Poehler. Next thing you know, she's their executive producer. They've got a hit show on Comedy Central. We've seen it with YouTubers for the last decade or more. So I love the fact that this has consolidated the idea for all of us who may not have thought we could be the ones to create content from our own houses and do it our way. I've certainly noticed some of the podcasts that I've just launched of my own, the caliber of the guests I can get because it's via Zoom. I'd love to think they'd like to talk to me wherever, but the fact of the matter is to try and get them into a studio, basically clear out maybe half a day effectively with the travel and the interview. That might have been a taller order, but suddenly you can make your voice heard alongside voices who you would like to hear, because people have a bit of time on their because they're not in studios and on stages as much, but it's very easy to connect powerfully with people via Zoom. So and as for the working from home thing, well, very similar to Scott, only instead of being in Singapore with a mountain bike track at the back, I'm in Camden, so I've got people dealing drugs at the back of my house. So very similar, yeah, I'll continue enjoying trying to ignore that while I'm doing sensible things like this right now.
Tim, I want to pick up on something that that you said actually in your speech, that was about the level of trust in government. And we've got a question about, you know, how there's been so much criticism, especially early on, hasn't there, in the way the government has been seen to handle this, or the way in which it's reacted to information as it's come in. A lot of criticism about that. And also, even yesterday, we're seeing these stories about big business, aren't we? There's been this news story about James Dyson and him wanting to come back to the UK but protect his tax status. I mean, trust in big business and government is a little bit shaky, isn't it? How do we rebuild that, if we do?
Oh, well, it's a very difficult subject. I mean, the interesting thing is that the polling data is very mixed on this, because you're absolutely right. All these stories about government sleaze and giving contracts to all their mates, you know, Matt Hancock met a fella down the pub and then 10 minutes later he had a £5 billion contract to supply PPE, you know, when all he'd previously supplied was, you know, things out of the back of a van. That cuts through. I've sat through a lot of focus groups where people are talking about that completely unprompted, and a lot of what's been in the you know, in the media over the last 2 weeks around this lobbying scandal, that is cutting through. The only other story you've seen cut through during the lifetime of this pandemic was when Dominic Cummings took a 300-mile car journey to test his eyesight, and that had a huge effect on, you know, public trust in how the government was handling the pandemic. The weird thing is that if you look at the opinion polls, the Tory party is 6, 8, 10 points ahead of Labour. Boris Johnson's personal ratings are above those of Keir Starmer. And actually, if you sit through these focus groups, there's a sort of, the pandemic's actually not a very good example of all this, because most people are giving the government the benefit of the doubt. They can see that this was a very difficult situation, and they can see that maybe Labour would have handled it differently. They might have handled it better, but it's not a sort of slam dunk as far as they're concerned. And they kind of get that this was a tricky situation. Weirdly, I think, I mean, I wrote about this at the weekend. I think the fact that Boris Johnson is kind of known by the public to be a little bit of a rogue, a little bit free and easy with his, you know, facts in inverted commas, has probably helped him a little bit. I was talking to a former minister a week or so ago who said, well, look, nobody trusted him to start with, so it's quite hard to lose that sense of trust. You know, what they want from him is to be seen to be, you know, not, it's not a case of they're outraged that he's giving all these contracts to all these rich people. What they want is him to bung them a load of cash and a load of jobs as well. And that's what I suspect the government will be judged on. If you talk to people in Downing Street, what they want to achieve is, you know, this lobbying stuff's a sort of sideshow. They've made certain pledges about what they're going to do for these communities, a lot of whom have been hit really hard by COVID. You know, the economic damage, the health damage has, you know, probably been disproportionately in those red wall seats that the Tories won from Labour in 2019. And Boris Johnson knows that a lot of those people voted Conservative for the first time in their lives, and that he kind of owes it to them to do something. And the thing about Boris Johnson is he's probably the most effective and cynical politician that any of us have seen for a very long time. And what that means is he wants to be re-elected. And if he wants to be re-elected, he's going to have to help those people. And I think at some level, you know, the trust insofar as it exists between the governed and the governing is that they sort of trust that because he's in it for himself, he'll be in it for them, and that's how he'll be judged when the next election comes around. So the best thing the government can do is try and deliver on those manifesto promises to level up, and if it pulls that off, then we'll be you know, enjoying / stuck with this government for a good deal longer.
I want to throw a quick question to all of you. We've only got a few minutes left, so quick answers if you can, please. Cally, has the pandemic made us more risk averse or more open to change?
I would say if you were to slice and dice the world on that one, you might get a bit of a 50-50 answer. I know as the mother of an autistic teenage boy, it's made him more risk averse. He took Boris's advice very seriously. He's like, Boris has told me to stay home, protect the NHS and save my high score on Dungeons and Dragons. So he's got finding it a bit harder to get out in the world at the moment. But then I think other people have thought that they really, it's made us even more sort of have more of a sort of wanderlust, and we've had to reinvent, right? Maybe a friend of mine wrote a brilliant book about how losing your job might be the best thing that ever happens to you, Eleanor Twiddle. And I think that that may well be the case sometimes when you're forced into, it's like people who leave a job, not that I'm telling everyone to go and leave their jobs, but rarely do you meet someone who took the plunge, left one career to try something else, who a year or two down the line goes, God, I wish I'd never been brave enough to try that. So I would say that it's probably about 50-50, but you may be finding that risk takers are coming from unexpected places and perhaps unexpected demographics as well. Perhaps the oldies like me, or the whatever we are, I'm not quite baby boomer, and not the generation X's, perhaps we're going to try some things rather than downsizing. Maybe we'll all be upsizing and trying to be bolder, braver and more seen. So yeah, that's my thought.
Thank you. Scott, are we bolder and braver, or are we crawling back into our cave as soon as we can?
So I'm going to use a fairly morbid example, and they say that your first divorce is always the hardest. And so I think we're in a period now where so many people have been shaken out of their foundations to challenge things they've never thought they'd challenge in their life, either core beliefs or the foundations of something. And so I think that opens the door for possibilities. But as kind of, I think it's still going to be around. It's going to be a personal preference. For some people, I anticipate there'll be a ton of people that still wear face masks years after they don't have to. But there'll be a whole bunch of people that are capitalizing up on the regrowth opportunities in the coming years as well.
I think I'm going to be one of those persistent mask wearers for sure. Tim, are you a risk taker, or are you embracing change?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, isn't it? I think the pandemic's been a force multiplier. I think if you were inclined in one direction, you've probably got more of what you were. I think with me, I tolerate wearing a mask. I mean, when the masks first appeared, I thought, oh, this is ridiculous. We're not the Far East. We don't do things like that here now. And now I look at people and think, well, what, it's not difficult, mate. Put a mask on. But equally, I think there's a bit of a live for today sense and a feeling of, life is a bit strange and fragile, and we need to grasp passing opportunities a bit more readily than we used to. So I think in terms of health, I think people might be more risk averse, but I think in terms of life and how you live it and what you want to do with yourself, it may be that people start doing things a bit more radically.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much to Tim Shipman, Scott Bales and Cally Beaton for their time this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us, for sending so many questions. I hope you've enjoyed it and it's given you plenty of food for thought. And hopefully we'll see you again shortly at one of these events. Thank you.